That can't be real, a young German voice whispered in the darkness of the train car, and for a moment no one answered because none of them yet knew what waited beyond the steel doors. The transport had crossed the Atlantic in silence. The women packed shoulder to shoulder inside a converted troop carriage that smelled faintly of salt air, oil, and damp wool. Somewhere outside, gulls cried over the harbor. The train slowed with a long metallic groan, wheels grinding against the rails as dawn spread pale light across the eastern sky. Inside the car, 20 German women stood motionless, their gray prisoner uniforms creased from days of travel, their faces tight with the same quiet question. This was America, or so they had been told. Anna Keller stood near the small barred window, her fingers wrapped around the cold metal frame. She was 26 years old, a former field nurse who had spent 2 years moving from one temporary hospital to another across North Africa before her capture. She had seen deserts, burning sun, endless columns of trucks, and wounded soldiers. But she had never seen America. In Germany, they had been taught what to expect. America was supposed to be loud but disorganized, rich but soft, powerful only on paper. The propaganda films had shown factories struggling, soldiers unprepared, equipment scarce. The message had been simple and repeated until it sounded like fact. The United States could not sustain a long war. The train lurched again and finally stopped. For a few seconds, there was only the ticking of cooling metal and the distant cry of harbor cranes. Then the heavy door at the end of the car slid open with a sharp mechanical crack. Bright morning light flooded the compartment, forcing several of the women to raise their hands to their eyes. Anna blinked and stepped forward instinctively, drawn toward the opening. What she saw first was water. A vast harbor stretching farther than she expected, sunlight flashing across the surface like broken glass. Then she noticed the ships. Rows of them. Gray hulls lined the piers in disciplined formation, their towering superstructures rising above the docks like moving buildings. Destroyers, supply ships, oil tankers, and farther out, massive warships anchored in the channel, their silhouettes sharp against the morning sky. Anna felt her breath catch in her throat. She had never seen so many ships. In one place in her life, the harbor seemed endless. Dockyards stretched for what looked like miles, cranes swinging overhead as workers guided cargo into open holds. Trucks moved constantly along the waterfront roads, carrying crates, fuel drums, spare engines. Somewhere beyond the piers a formation of bombers rolled down a runway, their engines building into a deep mechanical roar that vibrated through the air and into the wooden floor of the train car. One lifted off, climbing steadily into the blue sky. Another followed less than 2 minutes later. Anna stared upward as the aircraft passed overhead, sunlight glinting off the wings. "That's not possible," she murmured again, almost to herself, because nothing she had been told about America explained what she was seeing now. The women stepped down from the train one by one, their boots touching American soil with hesitant movements, as if the ground itself might feel different. The dock smelled of salt water, diesel fuel, and warm metal heating under the rising sun. Anna Keller followed the others in silence, her eyes still fixed on the harbor because the scene continued to unfold in ways that made even breathing feel strange. Everywhere she looked, something moved. Trucks rolled along the piers in long, steady lines. Forklifts carried crates stamped with military markings. Sailors in blue uniforms crossed the docks carrying toolkits and clipboards while civilian workers in oil-stained overalls guided cranes that lifted engines the size of small cars. Nothing appeared chaotic. Nothing appeared rushed. Everything moved with quiet efficiency. Another bomber thundered overhead, its shadow sliding across the concrete pier as it climbed into the sky. Anna watched the aircraft shrink into the distance. Then another engine began to roar from the runway somewhere beyond the warehouses. A second plane lifted. Then a third. The rhythm was steady enough to notice. One aircraft leaving the ground every minute and a half. Beside her, one of the younger prisoners named Greta Hoffman shook her head slowly. Greta had worked as a radio operator before the war and had spent months listening to Allied broadcasts that German officials claimed were exaggerations. Now she whispered, almost in disbelief, "How many aircraft can they possibly have?" Anna did not answer because she had already begun counting the shapes on the distant airfield. Even from this distance, she could see rows of bombers waiting near the runway. their wings stretching across the tarmac like metallic birds resting before flight. The line seemed to extend beyond the hangars and into the morning haze. A voice called out in careful German. The women turned and saw an American officer approaching with calm, deliberate steps. He was tall, perhaps in his late 30s, wearing the crisp khaki uniform of an army captain. A small nameplate read William Carter. His posture was relaxed, not threatening, and when he spoke again his accent carried the steady rhythm of someone who had practiced the language. "Welcome to Norfolk Naval Base," he said evenly. "You will be processed and transported to your camp shortly." His tone was professional, almost conversational, as if he were greeting travelers instead of prisoners of war. Anna noticed something unexpected. None of the guards nearby were shouting. No rifles were raised. Several soldiers stood casually beside parked trucks, drinking coffee from metal cups while watching the arriving train. One of them laughed at something another soldier said, the sound completely ordinary. The normality felt strange. Greta stepped closer to Anna and whispered again, her voice barely audible. "They told us this country was struggling. They said the factories could not keep up with the war." Anna looked across the harbor once more. A new ship was moving slowly along the channel, guided by tugboats toward the open Atlantic. Its steel hull rose high above the water, easily longer than the village street where Anna had grown up along the Elbe River. Workers lined the deck adjusting cables while cranes on the dock continued lifting crates into another vessel nearby. Nothing about the scene suggested shortage or weakness. Anna felt the quiet weight of realization pressing somewhere deep inside her thoughts. In Germany, the war had begun to feel like endurance, like holding on just long enough for victory to appear. But here, on the American coast, the scale of what she was seeing suggested something else entirely. An entire continent seemed to be working at once. Captain William Carter watched the women quietly for a moment before gesturing toward a row of military trucks waiting along the edge of the dock. The engines were already running, a low mechanical hum blending with the distant roar of aircraft climbing into the morning sky. "Please follow the guards," he said in steady German. "Transportation to the processing center will take only a few minutes." The women moved slowly, still turning their heads toward the harbor as if afraid the enormous scene might disappear if they looked away too long. Anna Keller climbed into the back of one of the trucks and sat on a wooden bench beside Greta Hoffman. The vehicle lurched forward almost immediately, rolling away from the train yard and onto a wide road that ran parallel to the waterfront. The scale of the base became even clearer once they began moving. Warehouses lined the road in long gray rows, their loading doors open as workers moved equipment in and out with constant motion. Forklifts carried crates marked with American stars. Flatbed trucks transported aircraft engines secured with heavy chains. At one intersection, Anna counted 6 military vehicles waiting patiently for a signal before turning toward the docks. No one seemed confused about where to go. Traffic moved in a quiet, organized rhythm that felt closer to a factory than a military base. As the truck continued deeper into the installation, the road curved toward an airfield. The sound of engines grew louder, vibrating through the metal frame of the truck bed. Anna leaned slightly forward and looked through the open rear gate. The runway stretched across the flat coastal land like a gray ribbon nearly a mile long. Along one side stood rows of bombers parked wingtip to wingtip. Their polished aluminum surfaces reflected the sun so brightly that Anna had to narrow her eyes to see clearly. Ground crews moved between the aircraft carrying toolboxes and fuel hoses. One bomber began rolling toward the runway while another lifted into the air above it, climbing steadily over the harbor. The timing seemed almost mechanical. Greta noticed it as well. "They do not even pause," she murmured. "As soon as one leaves, another takes its place." Anna watched the aircraft accelerate, its engines producing a deep, continuous thunder before the wheels left the runway and folded upward. The bomber banked gently toward the Atlantic Ocean and disappeared into the distant haze. A moment later, another aircraft began moving forward from the long waiting line. Captain Carter's truck drove beside theirs for several seconds, the officer standing in the passenger seat with one hand resting on the open door frame. He looked toward the runway, then back at the women sitting silently in the truck bed. Anna gathered the courage to speak. "Captain," she called carefully in German. Carter turned his head slightly. "Yes." Anna hesitated only a second. How many planes leave this base each day? Carter studied her expression for a moment before answering. His voice remained calm, almost matter of fact. Enough to keep the supply lines moving, he said. Then he added quietly, and this is only one airfield. The words settled into the truck like a weight. Anna turned her head back toward the endless line of aircraft waiting to depart. For the first time since the journey began, she understood that what she had seen at the harbor was not an exception. It was only a small part of something far larger. The convoy of trucks continued along the wide concrete road until the airfield slowly disappeared behind a line of large steel hangars, yet the sound of engines still echoed faintly across the base like distant thunder. Anna Keller kept looking over her shoulder as long as the runway remained visible because the sight of those endless aircraft had unsettled something deep in her understanding of the war. For years, she had believed the conflict was a matter of endurance, that whichever nation held out the longest would eventually gain the advantage. But what she had just seen suggested something different entirely. The trucks turned onto another road that led deeper into the naval base, passing long rows of warehouses built from corrugated steel and painted in dull industrial gray. Each building stretched hundreds of feet across the flat coastal land, and every loading dock was busy. Workers rolled crates along conveyor belts. Forklifts moved pallets stacked with spare parts. A train of flatbed rail cars stood on a nearby track, carrying what looked like aircraft wings wrapped in protective coverings. Nothing stood still for more than a few seconds. Greta Hoffman leaned closer to Anna and spoke quietly so the guards would not hear. This looks like an entire city devoted to war. Anna nodded slowly because the comparison felt accurate. Back home in Germany, factories were often hidden or scattered across different towns, partly to avoid aerial bombardment and partly because resources had become limited as the war dragged on. Here the situation appeared entirely different. Everything was concentrated, organized, and constantly moving forward with a confidence that was difficult to ignore. The truck slowed near an intersection where several military vehicles waited for a signal to proceed. Anna noticed a large sign posted beside the road. It listed directions in bold white letters. Shipyard to the east. Supply depot ahead. Aircraft maintenance to the west. Even the lettering was clean and carefully painted, as if someone expected this place to operate for a very long time. As they waited, another group of trucks passed by carrying wooden crates stamped with shipping codes and destination markings. One of the soldiers standing beside the convoy noticed Anna studying the labels. He was a young American private with dust on his boots and a cup of coffee balanced in one hand. He followed her gaze for a moment and smiled politely before speaking in careful German. Those go to Europe, he said. Food, medical supplies, spare parts. Everything moves through here. Anna looked back at him, surprised by the casual tone of the explanation. The soldier did not sound proud or boastful. He sounded matter of fact, like someone describing a routine task that happened every day. Greta asked the question that had been forming in her mind since the harbor. Does all of America work like this? The soldier shrugged slightly and took another sip of coffee. Pretty much, he answered. Factories in Michigan build the engines. Texas sends the fuel. Kansas grows the food. It all comes together at places like this. The traffic signal changed and the convoy of trucks began moving again. Anna turned forward and watched the road stretching ahead through the base. The soldier's simple explanation echoed in her thoughts because it carried a meaning far larger than the few words he had spoken. The harbor, the airfield, the warehouses, the endless lines of vehicles and equipment were not isolated examples of strength. They were pieces of a much larger system, and that system seemed to reach far beyond the coastline they had just arrived on. The trucks continued forward through the base until the harbor and airfield disappeared behind rows of warehouses and fuel depots, yet the rhythm of the place never seemed to slow. Anna Keller sat quietly on the wooden bench in the back of the truck, watching the landscape unfold with the steady patience she had learned during long days in field hospitals. Every few seconds something new appeared along the roadside. A line of tanker trucks carrying aviation fuel. A train pulling. Dozens of freight cars filled with crates stamped with Black American stars. Workers in coveralls guiding forklifts across concrete yards that stretched for acres. The entire base felt less like a military installation and more like an enormous machine where every person and vehicle moved with a clear purpose. Greta Hoffman leaned forward slightly, her eyes following a column of trucks that turned toward a distant row of fuel tanks. The metal cylinders rose above the ground like giant silver towers, each one easily taller than a 3-story building. "I cannot imagine how much fuel is stored here," she said quietly. Anna did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched a group of mechanics pushing a propeller assembly across the pavement on a wheeled stand. The blades were nearly 10 feet long, polished metal catching the sunlight as they moved toward one of the hangars. "Enough to keep those bombers flying every day," Anna finally replied. The convoy slowed again as it approached another section of the base where several large buildings stood side by side. These were different from the warehouses they had passed earlier. Tall windows lined the walls, and smoke rose from thin chimneys along the roof. Inside, machines could be heard running in a steady metallic rhythm. As the truck rolled closer, Anna realized what the buildings were. Repair factories. Through the open loading doors, she could see aircraft engines mounted on heavy steel frames, while technicians worked around them with tools and measuring equipment. Some engines were being assembled piece by piece. Others were already complete, ready to be shipped back to the airfields they had just left behind. Captain William Carter's truck pulled alongside again as the convoy slowed near a checkpoint gate. The officer glanced briefly toward the factories before looking at the women in the truck bed. "Aircraft maintenance," he explained calmly in German, noticing their attention. "Engines come in from different airfields for inspection and repair. When they leave here, they are ready to fly again." Greta studied the building carefully. "How many engines can they repair at once?" she asked. Carter looked toward the open doors where rows of engines stood waiting on metal stands. "Hundreds," he replied without hesitation. The simplicity of the answer left the women silent again. The trucks rolled through the checkpoint and continued along another wide road lined with electrical poles and communication cables. Anna noticed that the wires stretched in every direction across the base, connecting buildings, docks, and runways like veins carrying information instead of blood. She remembered the soldiers' earlier explanation about engines from Michigan, fuel from Texas, and food from Kansas. At the time, the statement had sounded almost casual. But now, after seeing more of the base, Anna began to understand what those words truly meant. The power of the place did not come only from ships or aircraft or factories. It came from the way everything was connected. Each building, each truck, each worker was part of a network so large that it extended far beyond the horizon. And for the first time since arriving on American soil, Anna felt a quiet realization forming inside her thoughts, one she had never allowed herself to consider before. The convoy moved farther inland through the sprawling base until the factories slowly faded behind them, replaced by long rows of storage yards where equipment was stacked in precise order across acres of concrete. Anna Keller noticed that even the smallest details seemed carefully arranged. Crates were grouped by size and color markings. Fuel drums were lined in perfect rows. Pallets of supplies stood beneath wide steel shelters that protected them from the coastal weather. Nothing appeared temporary. Everything looked designed to operate day after day without interruption. The truck slowed as it passed another rail yard where freight cars waited on several parallel tracks. Some cars carried spare aircraft parts while others held wooden boxes stamped with stenciled numbers and shipping destinations. Anna could read a few of the markings as the truck rolled by. England, Italy, North Africa. The crates were already moving toward other continents. Greta Hoffman noticed it as well. "They are sending supplies everywhere," she said quietly. Anna nodded. "Not only soldiers," she replied. "Machines, fuel, food, everything a war needs." The truck turned onto a road that climbed slightly above the rest of the base, giving them a wider view of the entire installation. From this higher ground, Anna could see the harbor again in the distance, the gray shapes of warships moving slowly through the channel like floating cities. Beyond the docks, the Atlantic stretched toward the horizon under a clear blue sky. Between the water and the hill where they now traveled stood the endless network they had just passed through. Warehouses, fuel tanks, repair, factories, airfields, roads crowded with trucks, railroad lines carrying freight toward the coast. It felt as if every piece of land within sight was working toward the same goal. Captain William Carter's vehicle slowed again beside their truck, the officer resting his arm along the door frame as he looked out across the base. For a moment he said nothing. Then he spoke in the same calm German they had heard earlier. You are seeing one of the largest supply ports in the United States. Anna listened carefully. Carter continued. Ships leave this harbor every day carrying equipment to our forces overseas. Aircraft depart from those airfields you saw earlier. And the factories keep repairing engines so the planes can continue flying. Greta studied the view silently before asking the question that had slowly grown in her mind. How many places like this exist in America? Carter looked toward the distant harbor before answering. More than you might expect, he said. His tone carried no pride, only quiet certainty. The convoy began moving again, descending the hill toward another section of the base where a cluster of administrative buildings stood near a fenced compound. The structures were smaller than the warehouses, but built with the same clean efficiency, their white painted walls reflecting the afternoon sunlight. Anna watched them approach while the meaning of everything she had seen settled deeper into her thoughts. In Germany, the war often felt like a struggle for survival, every factory working under strain, every shipment carefully rationed. Here the situation appeared almost reversed. Supplies seemed abundant. Machines were everywhere. Workers moved with the steady confidence of people who believed the system behind them would continue producing whatever was needed. Anna lowered her eyes briefly and folded her hands together in her lap. For years she had believed victory would come simply through determination. But now another possibility had begun to take shape in her mind, quiet and unsettling, like a truth that could no longer be ignored. The convoy slowed as it approached the fenced compound at the edge of the administrative district, and for the first time since leaving the harbor the constant roar of engines faded into a quieter background hum. The buildings here were smaller and more orderly, arranged along neat gravel paths lined with young oak trees that cast thin shadows across the afternoon ground. Anna Keller noticed the change. Immediately, the industrial noise of the base still echoed faintly in the distance. But here the atmosphere felt calmer, almost like the edge of a small town rather than the center of a vast military operation. The truck rolled to a gentle stop beside a long wooden barracks building painted in pale white. Nearby stood a flagpole where an American flag moved slowly in the coastal breeze. Several soldiers were standing near the entrance to the compound, speaking casually with a civilian worker who carried a clipboard. None of them appeared alarmed by the arrival of the prisoners. They simply watched the trucks with the same quiet professionalism Anna had seen throughout the base. Captain William Carter stepped down from his vehicle and approached the back of the truck where the women sat. His boots made a soft sound against the gravel as he stopped beside the tailgate. This will be a temporary processing station, he explained in careful German. You will remain here until transportation is arranged to the camp where you will stay. His tone remained calm and steady, as if explaining directions to travelers rather than prisoners of war. Anna climbed down from the truck along with the others, her boots touching the gravel road with a soft crunch. She looked around the compound while the guards organized the group into a loose line. The buildings were simple but well maintained. Windows stood open to allow the warm coastal air to move through the rooms. A small garden had been planted near the fence where tomatoes and green beans grew in tidy rows. Even the smallest details seemed surprisingly normal. Greta Hoffman noticed it too. It looks almost peaceful, she murmured. Anna followed her gaze toward the garden. The sight reminded her of the small farm where she had grown up beside the Elbe River. For a brief moment the memory felt strangely close, as if the long journey across the ocean had somehow folded the world into a smaller place. A young American soldier approached carrying a wooden crate filled with metal cups. He set the crate down on a nearby table and began filling each cup from a large steel container. Steam rose into the air, carrying the familiar smell of fresh coffee. The soldier glanced toward the group and spoke politely. You may have some if you would like, he said slowly in English, then repeated the offer in simple German. Several of the women hesitated before stepping forward. Greta accepted one of the cups and held it carefully between her hands, feeling the warmth spread through her fingers. Anna watched the scene quietly, noticing how ordinary everything seemed. No raised voices, no tension, just the simple routine of people working through another afternoon. Captain Carter stood a short distance away, speaking with one of the guards while occasionally glancing toward the group of prisoners. Anna studied his calm expression and then looked back toward the distant harbor barely visible between the buildings. Somewhere beyond those docks ships were still leaving for the Atlantic, Aircraft were still lifting into the sky, and factories were still repairing engines for the war effort. The entire system continued moving without pause. Yet here, inside this small compound, the world had grown quiet enough for Anna to hear her own thoughts clearly. And the realization that had been forming since the moment the train doors opened now felt impossible to ignore. Anna Keller held the warm metal cup carefully in both hands as the steam from the coffee drifted upward into the afternoon air. The smell was rich and unfamiliar after the long journey across the Atlantic, and for a moment, she simply stood there watching the thin white vapor rise while the quiet sounds of the compound surrounded her. Somewhere nearby a screen door opened and closed. Gravel shifted beneath the boots of a passing guard. In the distance, the faint rumble of aircraft engines continued like a reminder that the enormous base beyond the fence had not stopped moving. Greta Hoffman stood beside her, turning the cup slowly between her palms, as if the warmth itself required study. "I did not expect this," Greta said softly. Anna understood what she meant. In Germany, they had been told many things about American camps and American soldiers. Some stories described harsh conditions. Others described strict discipline and endless interrogation. But nothing in those descriptions had prepared them for a quiet compound where a soldier calmly offered coffee beside a small garden growing tomatoes under the sun. Anna lifted the cup and took a careful sip. The taste was strong but smooth, and the warmth traveled down into her chest in a way that felt strangely comforting after the long sea voyage. Around them, the other women began speaking. Quietly with one another, their voices cautious at first, and then gradually more relaxed as the ordinary rhythm of the place settled in. One woman sat on a wooden bench beneath the shade of the oak trees, while another walked slowly along the fence line, studying the buildings with the curiosity of someone trying to understand a new world. Captain William Carter remained near the entrance gate speaking with a clerk who carried a stack of papers beneath his arm. From time to time the officer glanced toward the prisoners. Not with suspicion, but with the calm watchfulness of someone responsible for the orderly flow of people through the system he served. Anna noticed that even here the efficiency she had seen across the base continued quietly. A jeep arrived carrying additional supplies. The clerk checked a list and directed 2 soldiers to carry the boxes inside one of the barracks. Another soldier adjusted the rope on the flagpole as the afternoon wind shifted slightly toward the sea. Nothing dramatic happened. Everything simply moved forward with quiet purpose. Greta lowered her voice again. "When we stood on the dock this morning, I thought the ships and aircraft were only for show," she said. "But after seeing the warehouses, the factories, the rail yards, it feels different now." Anna nodded slowly. The thought had been forming inside her mind for hours, growing clearer with every mile the trucks had carried them through the base. She looked once more toward the distant horizon where the tops of cranes were still visible above the roofs of the warehouses. Even from this distance, the shapes reminded her of the endless motion she had witnessed earlier. Ships leaving, aircraft departing, supplies moving across an entire continent. Anna set the empty cup down on the wooden table beside her and folded her hands together. The quiet realization that had followed her since the harbor now felt impossible to dismiss. Everything she had seen suggested that the strength of this place did not come from one factory or one fleet of ships. It came from the scale of the entire nation working together, a system so vast that even a single base like this was only a small piece of the whole. And as that understanding settled deeper into her thoughts, Anna felt the first clear hint that the war she believed she understood might be very different from the one unfolding beyond the fences of this quiet compound. The afternoon light slowly shifted across the compound as the hours passed, casting longer shadows from the oak trees and the wooden barracks. Anna Keller remained seated at the table where the empty coffee cups had been collected, her eyes moving across the quiet scene with the careful attention she had learned during years of watching hospital wards. Small details began to stand out now that the first shock of arrival had faded. A clerk carried a stack of neatly typed forms into one of the offices. A pair of soldiers repaired a loose fence post near the garden. Somewhere inside the barracks a radio played softly, the distant sound of American swing music drifting through the open window. None of it felt hurried. None of it felt temporary. Greta Hoffman sat beside Anna, resting her elbows on the wooden table as she watched a transport truck roll slowly past the outer gate. The truck disappeared toward the distant warehouses, leaving behind the faint smell of diesel and dust. When we first arrived this morning, Greta said quietly, I thought the ships in the harbor were meant to impress us. Anna glanced toward the road where the truck had vanished. I thought the same, she admitted. But now I am not so sure. Greta nodded slowly. The realization had been growing in both of their thoughts since the moment the train doors opened. Nothing they had seen during the day appeared staged or exaggerated. The ships moved because cargo had to be delivered. The aircraft departed because missions were scheduled. The warehouses were full because supplies were constantly arriving from somewhere farther inland. It was not a display. It was a routine. Captain William Carter walked across the compound carrying a folder beneath his arm, his boots making a soft crunch against the gravel path. When he reached the table, he paused for a moment, studying the women with the same calm expression he had worn since morning. Processing will begin shortly, he said in careful German. You will receive identification numbers and transportation orders for the camp where you will stay. Anna listened quietly, then looked toward the distant cranes that were barely visible above the rooftops. Captain, she said after a moment, this base seems enormous. Carter followed her gaze toward the horizon. For a second, he said nothing. Then he answered with the same quiet certainty she had heard before. It is large, he replied, but it is only one port. The words settled into the warm afternoon air. Greta blinked in surprise. Only one, she asked. Carter nodded. There are other naval bases, other airfields, other supply depots across the country. He spoke the sentence as if it required no further explanation. Anna felt a slow breath escape her chest as she looked again toward the harbor. The cranes, the ships, the endless lines of trucks and aircraft she had seen earlier in the day. All of it represented only a single point on a much larger map. Carter closed the folder beneath his arm and turned toward the office building where the clerk waited with the paperwork. You will understand more as time passes, he said calmly before walking away. Anna watched him go, then lowered her eyes to the wooden surface of the table. For years she had believed the war would be decided by courage, by sacrifice, by the determination of soldiers fighting across distant battlefields. Yet after one day inside this American base, another possibility had begun to take shape in her thoughts. Wars, she realized slowly, might also be decided by factories, railroads, harbors, and the quiet efficiency of millions of people working far from the front lines. The late afternoon sun lowered slowly over the compound, turning the white walls of the barracks a warm shade of gold, while the long shadows of the oak trees stretched across the gravel paths. Anna Keller sat quietly on the wooden bench outside the administrative building, listening to the calm rhythm of activity that continued around them. A clerk stepped outside carrying another stack of documents and pinned several forms to a notice board beside the entrance. Two soldiers carried a crate of supplies into the barracks with steady movements that suggested they had repeated the task many times before. Even the sound of the distant harbor seemed softer now, reduced to a faint murmur beyond the buildings. Greta Hoffman stood nearby watching the sky, where a single aircraft moved slowly toward the horizon. The plane was small compared with the bombers they had seen earlier, but its steady path across the bright afternoon sky reminded her of the endless departures from the airfield that morning. They do not seem to stop, Greta said quietly. Anna followed the direction of her gaze and nodded. Everything continues moving, she replied, even when we are sitting still. For several minutes neither of them spoke. The quiet allowed Anna's thoughts to move back across the day step by step, from the moment the train doors opened to the long drive through the base. She remembered the endless harbor filled with ships, the airfield where bombers lifted into the sky one after another, the warehouses stacked with supplies destined for distant continents, and the factories repairing engines so aircraft could return to the air again. Each image seemed separate at first, but now they connected together in her mind like pieces of a map forming a single picture. Captain William Carter returned from the office building carrying several folders beneath his arm. He stopped near the group of women and spoke calmly in German so they could all understand. Your identification numbers have been prepared, he said. Transportation to the camp will arrive before sunset. His voice carried the same steady tone he had used throughout the day. There was no urgency, only the simple announcement of the next step in a process that seemed carefully organized long before they arrived. One of the women asked quietly, "How far is the camp?" Carter considered the question for a moment. A few hours by truck, he replied. It is located inland. Anna watched him closely. And the ships and aircraft we saw this morning? She asked carefully. They continue leaving every day? Carter gave a small nod. Every day, he answered. The work never really stops. He spoke the sentence without emphasis, as though describing something entirely ordinary. Yet for Anna the words carried a deeper meaning than he probably intended. She looked again toward the distant harbor where the tall cranes were barely visible against the evening sky. Somewhere beyond those docked ships were still preparing to cross the Atlantic. Somewhere beyond the airfield aircraft were still lifting into the sky. The scale of it all had seemed impossible when she first stepped off the train. Now it felt undeniable. Anna folded her hands together and drew a slow breath as the warm coastal air moved through the compound. For the first time since the war began, she allowed herself to consider a thought she had resisted for years. Perhaps the outcome of the war was not being decided only on distant battlefields. Perhaps it had already begun to take shape in places like this, where factories, railroads, and harbors quietly moved the strength of an entire nation across the ocean. The sun had begun to sink toward the western horizon when the sound of engines returned to the compound once again. Anna Keller looked up from the bench as a line of military trucks rolled slowly through the outer gate, their tires crunching across the gravel road with the steady rhythm she had heard all day. The vehicles moved without hurry, as if their arrival had been expected hours before. Captain William Carter stepped forward to meet them, exchanging a brief word with the driver before turning back toward the group of women. Transportation has arrived, he announced calmly in German. Please gather your belongings. The women rose quietly from the benches and tables where they had spent the afternoon. Most of them carried very little, only small bags or folded coats from the long journey across the ocean. Anna picked up her canvas satchel and glanced once more around the compound. The garden beside the fence rustled gently in the evening breeze. The clerk closed the office door and carried the remaining paperwork inside a leather folder. Even the young soldier who had served coffee earlier stood nearby watching the trucks with the relaxed posture of someone who had seen the same routine many times before. Greta Hoffman walked beside Anna as they approached the waiting vehicles. It feels strange to leave already, Greta said quietly. Anna nodded. The compound had only been a temporary stop, yet the calm atmosphere had given them time to think in ways the long journey had not allowed. The women climbed into the back of the trucks and settled along the wooden benches just as they had earlier in the day. The engines rumbled softly beneath them as the convoy turned toward the road leading away from the base. As the vehicles passed through the gate, Anna looked back one final time. From this distance, the small compound appeared peaceful beneath the fading light of evening. Beyond it, however, the larger base continued moving with the same quiet intensity she had witnessed since morning. In the distance, she could still see the tall cranes rising above the harbor. Farther away, the faint sound of aircraft engines drifted across the warm coastal air. The trucks rolled onto the main road and began climbing the same gentle hill they had descended earlier in the afternoon. When they reached the higher ground, Anna looked out across the landscape once again. The entire naval base stretched beneath them like a living map. Warehouses formed long geometric rows across the flat land. Rail lines curved toward the docks, carrying freight toward the waiting ships. Airfields extended across the coastline where aircraft still moved along the runways preparing for departure. Greta leaned slightly toward Anna as she followed the same view. When we first arrived, Greta said softly, I thought the ships were the most impressive thing. Anna watched a bomber lifting slowly into the evening sky above the distant runway. I thought so too, she replied. But now I think the ships are only a small part of it. The convoy began descending the hill toward the inland road that would carry them away from the coast. Anna kept her eyes on the horizon as long as the base remained visible. The cranes, the warehouses, the endless lines of trucks and aircraft. All of it seemed to move with a quiet confidence that was difficult to ignore. As the trucks continued inland and the harbor slowly disappeared behind the trees, Anna understood that what she had seen during this single day would remain in her memory for the rest of her life. Not because of fear, not because of intimidation, but because the scale of the system she had witnessed revealed something she had never fully imagined before. The strength of a nation could be measured not only by its soldiers, but by the silent power of its factories, its railroads, and the millions of ordinary people who kept them moving. The convoy of trucks continued inland as evening settled across the coastal plain, the last faint glow of the harbor fading behind a line of darkening trees. Anna Keller sat quietly on the wooden bench in the back of the truck, the steady vibration of the engine traveling through the metal frame beneath her boots. The road stretched ahead through farmland and scattered pine forests, far removed from the endless machinery and motion of the naval base they had just left behind. For a long time, none of the women spoke. The quiet of the countryside felt almost unreal after the constant activity of the port. Greta Hoffman eventually leaned slightly closer to Anna, her voice low enough that only Anna could hear it above the sound of the engine. "Do you think the entire country works like that?" she asked. Anna watched the fading light along the horizon before answering. "The soldier earlier said it does," she replied softly. Greta nodded, but did not speak again. The idea seemed too large to discuss easily. Anna allowed her thoughts to drift back through the day once more. The train doors opening at the harbor. The rows of warships stretching across the water. The bombers lifting into the sky every 90 seconds from the long runway. The warehouses filled with supplies destined for places thousands of miles away. At first, each scene had felt overwhelming on its own. Now she understood that none of them existed separately. They were all connected by something larger, something she had never seen so clearly before. The truck passed a small American town where a few streetlights had already begun to glow along the main road. Anna noticed a grocery store with a brightly painted sign in the window and a gas station where a mechanic wiped his hands on a cloth while speaking with a driver beside a parked car. The scene lasted only a moment as the convoy continued forward, but it added another quiet detail to the picture forming in her mind. Even far from the harbor and airfields, life here appeared steady and organized. The road carried them deeper inland as darkness slowly replaced the last colors of sunset. A soldier sitting near the tailgate lit a small lantern so the women could see inside the truck bed. The warm yellow light illuminated the tired faces around her, yet Anna could tell that many of them were thinking about the same thing. Greta finally spoke again. "Back home they told us America would run out of strength," she said carefully. Anna considered the words for several seconds before answering. "Perhaps they believed that," she said. "But what we saw today suggests something different." The truck continued forward along the quiet road, the lantern swaying gently with each movement of the vehicle. Anna leaned back against the wooden rail and closed her eyes for a moment, allowing the images of the harbor, the airfields, and the endless factories to pass once more through her thoughts. By the time the convoy finally slowed near a distant set of buildings surrounded by fences and guard towers, the realization that had followed her since morning felt complete. The strength she had witnessed was not loud or theatrical. It was systematic, patient, and vast beyond anything she had imagined. And as the trucks rolled through the gate of the camp that would become her new home, Anna understood that what she had seen during that single day in America would change the way she understood the war forever. The trucks rolled slowly through the final gate as night settled across the quiet countryside, their headlights sweeping across the gravel yard inside the prisoner camp. Anna Keller opened her eyes as the vehicle came to a gentle stop, the soft sway of the lantern above her finally becoming still. For a moment, none of the women moved. The journey that had begun at the harbor that morning had carried them far inland, away from the sound of ship horns and aircraft engines, into a place that felt calm and distant from the immense machinery of war they had witnessed only hours earlier. Anna stepped down from the truck with the others and looked around the camp yard. Wooden barracks stood in neat rows beneath tall floodlights that cast pale circles across the ground. The air was cool now, carrying the faint scent of pine trees from the dark forest beyond the fence. A few guards stood near the entrance, speaking quietly with the drivers while a clerk waited beside a small wooden table prepared for the final registration. Everything moved with the same steady order she had noticed since arriving in America. Greta Hoffman stood beside Anna, adjusting the strap of her small bag while she studied the quiet camp. "It feels strange," Greta said softly. "After everything we saw today." Anna nodded. The contrast between the enormous naval base and this simple camp felt almost unreal, as if the two places belonged to entirely different worlds. Yet she understood now that they were connected by the same system that stretched across the country like an invisible network. A guard motioned for the women to form a line near the table where identification numbers were being recorded. As Anna awaited her turn, she lifted her eyes toward the dark sky above the camp, somewhere far beyond the trees. The aircraft she had seen earlier were still crossing the Atlantic. Ships were still leaving the harbor carrying supplies and equipment toward distant battlefields. Factories were still building engines and machines that would travel across oceans and continents. The quiet camp where she now stood was only a small resting place within that vast movement. When her turn arrived, the clerk handed her a small card bearing her identification number. Anna accepted it and stepped aside, slipping the card carefully into her satchel. The simple gesture marked the beginning of a new chapter of her life, one that would unfold slowly behind the fences of the camp. Yet her thoughts remained far away, returning again to the moment the train doors opened that morning. She could still see the endless harbor, the bombers lifting into the sky one after another, the warehouses filled with supplies moving across the world. At the time the sight had felt impossible. Now it felt undeniable. Greta joined her near the barracks door, her voice quiet in the still night. "Do you think the war will last much longer?" she asked. Anna looked toward the distant horizon beyond the dark trees. For a moment she did not answer. Then she spoke with the calm certainty that had slowly formed inside her thoughts throughout the day. "After what we saw today," she said quietly, "I think the answer may already exist somewhere far beyond the battlefield." The floodlights hummed softly above the camp yard as the guards guided the women toward the barracks. Anna stepped inside and paused for a final moment at the doorway, listening to the quiet night that surrounded the camp. The world beyond the fences continued moving with silent determination, and she understood that the truth she had discovered during that single day would stay with her long after the war itself had finally ended.